Hello and welcome to Legislatures, The Inside Story, a podcast from the National Conference of State Legislatures. Your host is Tim Story, the CEO of NCSL. Tim talks with legislators, journalists, academics, political analysts, and others about the ideas and policies shaping state legislatures today. Tim's guest for this podcast is David Toscano, a 7-term legislator in the Virginia House of Delegates who held the seat once occupied by Thomas Jefferson in the Virginia House of Burgesses. First elected in 2005, he served as Democratic leader in the House from 2011 to 2018. In 2021, Toscano published Fighting Political Gridlock: How States Shape Our Nation and Our Lives. He talked with Tim about the critical role of states in affecting our daily lives, how states have led the way on a number of critical issues, and, in contrast, how increasingly ineffective a legislature is at the federal level. He also talked about the need to increase people's understanding of the role of state government. Here's their discussion.
Hello, this is Tim Story, once again your host for the NCSL podcast Inside Story about the legislatures. I am, as always, just super excited because I just love talking to interesting people. And once again, we've managed to get somebody on the podcast who I know is going to be really interesting and has a fascinating background, who knows legislatures inside out. And that is Delegate David Toscano from Virginia. So thank you so much, David, for being with us today.
It's great to be with you.
We're going to dive right in and sort of, help our listeners know more about your long history in and around state government and state legislatures. So I think you're from Charlottesville, Virginia, but take us into the Wayback Machine and tell us your story of bring us to today.
I guess you could say I'm just a small town country lawyer that is practicing law in Charlottesville, Virginia. And I've been in public service, at least till I retired recently, for 25 years. 12 years in local office, and including mayor of Charlottesville, and then 14 years in the legislature, holding the successor seat to the one that was held by Thomas Jefferson way, way back. I was the Democratic leader in the Virginia House for 7 years in the early 2010s, and got the Democrats to the point where they were within a coin toss of being at parity with the Republicans in the House of Delegates. So I'm the luckiest guy in the world, living in a great place and representing great people. And I've just written this book, and it's given me a lot of opportunity to talk about things I really enjoy, which are states and how important they are to the future of the country.
So did you grow up in and around the western part of Virginia, not West Virginia, and around the Charlottesville part of the country?
Well, it's an interesting story. I grew up in upstate New York, Syracuse, New York. Graduated and went to school up in upstate New York at Colgate University. Then went on to grad school at Boston College, got a PhD there, and then came down to Virginia and just found myself a job at the University of Virginia teaching sociology. Decided to go to law school a couple of years later, and I've been practicing since the mid-'80s. So I've just really been lucky in my life, had a lot of great experiences.
You were on the UVA faculty, which not everybody may know is the University of Virginia, that is located in Charlottesville, home of Thomas Jefferson, which I love that historic connection. Who wouldn't? And so you're teaching there and decided to go to law school. What prompted you to do that?
Well, I guess like a number of people my age, when I graduated from college, it was all about trying to figure out a way to change the world. And I went to grad school thinking that I would change the world by teaching people. And then I decided, well, maybe I could change the world by being an attorney and advocating for people in court. And that's why I moved from academia to the law. I was interested in teaching primarily and not research and writing at the time, and certainly not doing a lot of the quantitative analysis that a lot of academics were doing at the time. So I said, well, this is another profession that I could undertake, and I've enjoyed every single minute of it since.
I'm always curious about a little more of the backstories of how people wind up, where they are, especially in the legislature eventually. And so that seems like an unusual path to come from the sociology world into the legal world. Did you So you practiced in Charlottesville at the same time you were running for mayor and becoming the mayor, or before that?
had finished up my law degree and, opened up a small firm in Charlottesville, and decided about 5 years into my practice that I saw things going on in the city that people were doing who were in elective office that I thought I could do better. So I offered myself for election and then won again and became mayor and then won again. And then when the delegate from this area, who had been there for 24 years, decided to retire, I said, well, I see all the things that we can do at the state level, so I'm going to go for that. And I was elected immediately into this minority within the House of Delegates in Richmond. And that was an experience that was so shocking because they just really did things differently in Richmond. They talk about one of the cardinal rules of politics is you have to learn how to count. When I was on the city council in Charlottesville, I had to count to 3 because there were only 5 members. Now I had to start counting to 7, and then I had to count again, and then I had to count again, and then it went over to the Senate, and I had to figure out a way to count again. And there was always a governor out there willing to veto something that he didn't like. So there are a lot of things that you had to learn. And I guess the sociological background was helpful because you learn a little bit about structures and informal norms of a body and how you respect those norms and those values and how you respect other people in order to get things done. I like to think I got a few things done while I was there.
Help me with the timeline. When did you get elected to the House of Delegates?
So I was elected to the House in the fall of 2005. I was elected the same year that Tim Kaine was elected governor. I came in at that time, and I think there might have been 37 Democrats out of a total of 100 delegates. The Senate was probably controlled maybe by 1 or 2 votes by the Democrats at the time. It went back and forth constantly through my time in Richmond. But much of my time in the legislature was in the House where we were in the minority. And that just puts a very different wrinkle on how you approach your job.
Just a little more background before we dive into the book. Virginia had been held by the Democrats, of course, for probably over 100 years. Up until the early 2000s, it probably only went to the Republicans in, I'm sort of guessing, to 02 or, well, you guys have that odd year elections, 01, 03, somewhere in that range. Or no, it might have been before that. It might have been the 90s. I take that back.
No, it was really about 2000. And of course, it was a different Democratic Party. I mean, you had a party that was pretty much the Dixiecrats. Charlottesville had been kind of a liberal haven, so it didn't have the Dixiecrats controlling the Charlottesville Democratic Party. But it was a very different Democratic Party, and the changes over the last 20 years in Virginia have been unbelievable. But you got to remember, I'm a guy coming from the North. I walk in, I would spend time in libraries in the North, and the paintings I would see on the wall were paintings of Abraham Lincoln. You never saw a painting of Abraham Lincoln in a public library in Virginia. You'd see Robert E. Lee, and you'd see statues of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson all over the place.
And Thomas Jefferson, too, right? I mean, and Jefferson and Madison, Monroe, all those Virginians who were in the Founding Fathers group. But I take your point. And it's also interesting to me that the House of Delegates, now there are you and Thomas Jefferson's seat, that he was in the House of Delegates before becoming president, and his many other things he did in his resume. It's also the oldest legislature in the United States, right? The House of Burgesses is the forebear of the House of Delegates.
With the exception of the House of Commons, it's the longest consecutively operating Democratic body.
In the world, period. That's an interesting pedigree to this whole background that you bring to sort of looking at today's politics. And it's a little more background for me. Who was the speaker? Was Bill Howell, the speaker the whole time you were a minority leader or Democratic leader?
When I came in, Bill Howell was the speaker, and he retired 2 years before I did. He was the speaker the entire time. There was a 2-year speaker, Kirk Cox, and then he left when the Democrats took control. So it was really Bill Howell and me duking it out every day on the floor when I'd be raising procedural motions and questions about different bills that perhaps the Democrats didn't care for so much.
So we have alluded to the fact that you have a new book, just published in only the last few month or two, formally. University of Virginia Press, is it through University of Virginia?
Yes, it's called Fighting Political Gridlock, How States Affect the Country and Our Lives. Senator Mark Warner wrote the foreword to the book. It's published by the University of Virginia Press this September. It's getting some good traction, so hope people will pick it up. And, it's written at a great time because there are so many things going on in the states right now. And the book opens with the discussion of how states reacted to the pandemic. People think that the federal government has all the power, but Joe Biden couldn't enact a mask mandate across the country, even if he wanted to, because it really wouldn't be constitutional. But the governors could, and that's what they did. And so the book starts with a discussion of executive power in the governors throughout all the states and how those policies started to be enacted, not by legislatures, which was very interesting, but by governors. And in fact, the governors pretty much left legislatures out of the mix. And now you've got the sort of the backlash to that, where a lot of legislatures are saying, well, wait a minute now, I think this is too much power. And they're trying to cut back on the governor's ability to enact these emergency orders.
Believe me, I heard a lot about that from both parties. And I think it's probably because of the access of the legislators. They were hearing it daily from many constituents who did or did not like necessarily what the governors were doing. And of course, the governors were acting in their emergency capacity. And a lot of states went back and reviewed those emergency capacity laws, like, how long does this Band-Aid exist? So it's a fascinating topic. Why now? When did you start the book, and what made you decide to write this book now?
Well, I actually started the book 2 years ago. I'd kept notebooks of my time in the legislature for all 14 years. So I've been keeping notes on this for a while. I'd originally intended on writing a book that encompassed all 25 years of my experience, but my editor looked at it. It was over 1,000 pages. She said, you can't publish this. So we broke it in two, and this one's all about states and a national focus. There's another one coming later about Virginia and that experience over 20 years. I just thought that people just don't understand how significant the states are in everything that happens in this country. I mean, I think people are starting to wake up a little bit more because redistricting is before us. But, a lot of people don't even realize that redistricting is a state function. They think that the Congress redistricts, or at least they think that Congress draws their own lines, when in reality, the legislatures do it. And the way the legislatures draw the lines determines a lot about who gets elected to Congress, and therefore what policies are enacted by Congress. So you think about that, and in the context of the last federal election, you begin to see the states can have incredible power in what goes on. Beyond that, of course, we've got everything from education to criminal justice. And people think it's the federal government plan that led to higher rates of incarceration around the country, when in reality, it's all state policy, pretty much state policy. It's state laws that people violate. It's state prisons that they go and serve in. And it's state rules that allow them either to get out early or stay longer. So all of these things have a role to play in how our lives are affected. And a lot of people just are so focused on Washington, they don't pay attention to states.
Yeah, I mean, you're preaching to a very sympathetic ear, someone who believes that maybe the states are appropriately the right place to be making policy on these big issues in some partnership with the local governments to that as well. Is there any, you cited criminal justice and, CJ issues, but is there any anecdote or factoid that just brings this home, that says, hey, American public, and I haven't checked this in a while, but the last time I saw, less than 17% of Americans could name one of their state legislators. I'm sure it's higher for Congress, probably not dramatically higher, but certainly everyone knows the president. Probably people know they probably know their governor. Or at some higher rate. But the disconnect between the general public's knowledge of the impact of the state policy, the state capitals on their lives versus the Washington on their lives. Anything that just really brings it home for you?
Well, there are a couple. I mean, there are lots of examples out there, but one that I sort of fixed on immediately was this issue about water. And I got interested in what happened in Flint, Michigan in the last decade, where Flint made a decision to change the source of its water supply. Everyone thinks that was done at a local level, and to some extent it was, but it was a function of state policy. Michigan has a law that allows the state to essentially impose an emergency manager on a city that is in financial stress, which makes some sense because you want to try to help cities. And in Flint, of course, had undergone deindustrialization for years. It was a very, very poor city. And Michigan, the state, stepped in through the governor and said, we're going to take over this city. And the emergency manager made a decision that to save water, they would get water for the city from a different source. They didn't treat the water. And what happened was that the lead pipes, the pipes in the city started to corrode. People started to get sick. Some people died. And something that was supposed to save the city a lot of money in the end has cost millions and millions of dollars, and it's still not fixed. And then there are other things, we think about energy. I mean, think about what happened in Texas just a year ago, where Texas was hit with a surprise, pretty dramatic snowstorm, and their entire grid almost went out. Now, you say to yourself, well, that's a federal issue. Well, it is and it isn't, because the Texas legislature and the Texas state government years ago made a decision that they were going to separate Texas from the national grid. They had their own grid for electricity. And they also made another decision, and this is also, a lot of times these are made at the state level. They decided that they were going to keep rates low for consumers, an admirable goal. But what it meant was you didn't have money to reinvest in the system to create resiliency against this kind of dramatic event. So that's a state decision that was made, a couple of state decisions that had a really dramatic effect on Texas. And so you have a whole series of these things that seem to come out of nowhere, but when you drill down more carefully, many of them are state issues that need to get resolved.
I mean, and then the other side of the coin, what's not being resolved in Washington. I'm not going to be entirely accurate, so I'll preface by saying this, but roughly in the 117th Congress, which I think was the last, I think we're in 118 now, if memory's right. I could have that slightly wrong. The last Congress, the 2-year biennial Congress that, President Trump is in the White House, Democrats control the House, and I think Republicans control the Senate. Yeah, so you've got divided government. They enact roughly 400 pieces of legislation. And roughly a third of those are to rename a federal building or to issue a commemorative coin. And then there's another, many of them were just continuation to, extend laws that were up for expiration. And so they're just not able to do major policy in Washington. Now, of course, there were some big COVID stimulus relief packages. I don't want to imply that Congress does nothing with the president. But at the same time, states had passed tens of thousands of pieces of legislation.
Well, we do 400 in a day. I mean, it's amazing how fast the state legislatures work versus the federal government. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but that's the case.
No, that's a great point. I love that, actually. And it drives home the point. And it's not to say that more bills and more legislation is necessarily the right or best thing. There's obviously a balance there, back to the old saying of, the republic is safe again, the legislature has adjourned, or something along those lines. What were the other takeaways when you started thinking about this big question of what happens in the state capitals versus what happens in Washington? What did you take away from that?
Here's another example, Tim, and I think you can appreciate this. I mean, there are examples from the progressive side and there are examples from the conservative side where states have to get in and do stuff that people want to have done that's not being done at the federal level. So on the progressive side, people are very concerned about climate change. And we're hoping that the federal government would do something about it, because really it is kind of a federal problem. But what you're seeing, because the feds are really inactive on this, is you're seeing states step up and do things that are creative. In the Northeast, for example, a consortium of states created this regional greenhouse gas initiative. They call it RGGI, in which a group of states, I think there's 9 or maybe 10 now, joined together to try to cut emissions in their states and affect the CO2 levels in the atmosphere. And they're doing that because the federal government won't do what it's supposed to be doing and trying to address the issues of climate change because the politics are so toxic. You also see it historically, their big push to try to solve the healthcare crisis for a long, long time, right? So Massachusetts says, well, okay, you guys won't do it. And under a Republican governor, Mitt Romney, they embraced the Massachusetts Affordable Care Act back in 2006, probably one of the greatest examples of states as the laboratories of democracy you can find, where they create the individual mandate modeled after a conservative principle where everybody ought to have skin in the game. They ought to all join a system together to keep costs down, and will provide subsidies for those people who can't afford to pay. And that was enacted in Massachusetts in 2006, and then it became the model for Obamacare, even though it was very controversial at the time. So you've got states who say, we're going to take this on, and we're going to try to run with it and do something with it because the federal government won't.
Another element to this, of course, when you embrace this kind of federalism, is that you're sort of acknowledging that there are some states that are far more conservative, some states that are far more progressive and liberal, and they might pursue policies that nationally you'd never get agreement to. And I was trying to think of a conservative analog to that, and I don't know if this fits perfectly, but I was thinking about the fact that Arizona and Texas have been very concerned about issues along the border that are extremely complicated, not just people coming into the country, but also illegal activity on the border in terms of drugs and that kind of thing. So Texas steps in and starts to do more border security and these kinds of things, which may not be something you'd ever get agreement on in Washington. Washington has been looking at the immigration issue for decades without really doing anything of note on it, anything of substance. When you hear that, is that the way it should work? That conservative states pursuing conservative solutions, and even when those diverge, often. Look, the some of the social issues we're looking at, and of course there's national law that's being sorted out by the Supreme Court. So what are your thoughts on that?
This is why your job is so fascinating, and what my writing is so interesting to me, because there are so many different examples like that, even on things that I disagree with. Let's take example, reproductive choice, right? States like Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, I'm not sure North Carolina, a number of these states, their legislatures have passed laws in order to create a dilemma for the United States Supreme Court on Roe v. Wade. They are essentially innovating an attempt to get conservative positions adopted. And you can see it in other states, depending on their constitutions, where actually citizens can go ahead and try to initiate change. The good example with this would be marijuana legislation, which initially began as a citizen initiative in a number of the Western states where you have citizen initiative written into state constitutions. And you can get me going on state constitutions for a long time, but there are a lot of things in state constitutions that are not in the federal constitution that people can exploit. So the people got marijuana legalized in a number of states. And who followed on behind that? A number of legislatures who decided, well, maybe it was safe for me now to stick my foot in the water, my toe in the water on this issue. The philosophical issues are fascinating, and that is what should be the proper balance. Because if you get too much of states' rights, you run the risk of creating two separate countries sort of within the United States. And I think that's a big issue we've got right now. Is there going to be an overarching set of values or norms that are going to operate our country? Or are we going to let the red states go their way, the blue states go their way, and then Colorado can pick up the pieces later on with their split government and how they're a purple state? So, I don't mean to make light of it, but it's an important philosophical issue that's going to face the country for a while.
Yeah, and of course we all eventually, the real clashes get wind up at the Supreme Court, right? Just as the abortion law in Texas is now before the Supreme Court to see if it complies or not with federal law. Of course, the case, we can't go into the weeds on this, but the case has to do with this enforcement mechanism in that law. But the bigger question, I think, will become before the court in some form or fashion. If you believe in federalism, it's where this local voters decide, and of course the Texas legislature is, and many of these legislatures are supported heavily by the voters on the Republican side, just as there are other legislatures that are supported heavily by the voters on the Democratic side. So it's part and parcel of that.
And all these states are different. I mean, I don't know how many of your listeners realize that Virginia is an incredible outlier when it comes to the selection of judges. Most states elect their judges. We do not. We select our judges from the legislature. Now, whether that's a better system or not is not clear to me. I mean, now I've been in Virginia long enough that I think we're just so exceptional that this is the best way to do it. But we're the outlier. If you look around the country at how much money is now being spent on these judicial elections and how politicized they are, even though they're supposed to be nonpartisan, it gets you worried about the ability of people to do their job in a way that just follows the rule of law and not some interpretation based on an ideology.
By the way, NCSL is headquartered in Colorado, so I am, physically located in Colorado. And it was one of the two states that did enact the retail use of cannabis through the ballot. Like you said, there are 26 states where citizens can put something on the statewide ballot. Functionally, it's less than that. There's some of those are nearly impossible to get them on the ballot, but around 20 states, that's the case. So I guess this leads me to another question, which is, what are you worried about, in terms of federalism and, the state's role in policymaking and the disconnect between citizen understanding of what happens in state capitals versus what happens in Washington and the lack of engagement there? What troubles you?
Well, there is a lot to worry about. The last chapter of my book is entitled Reimagining Civic Engagement, and it's designed partly to try to get state legislators to think about what that really means and what it means to put up political guardrails so that we're not going off the rails. For me, it's not just a question of the philosophical balance, but how you strike the balance in terms of engaging with each other. Because there is a real risk with our polarization that we're coming apart at the seams. I don't want to be too hyperbolic about what happened in January, but it did scare me right down to my toes about what that meant for the future of the country. And there are plenty of people who are hyperbolic on both sides of the political spectrum. And it's going to be incumbent upon leaders to basically be able to tell their bases to say, hey, cool it here. This is a place where you just can't go any farther than this. And if it means I don't get reelected, so be it. But I am going to speak truth to it as a way to say, yeah, the country is more important than you just playing out your own angst in the political system. And we see this all over the country. And so I'm worried. I mean, philosophically, I'm worried trying to find that balance. But we've been doing that for 230 years. The difference is that we're losing track of our shared values in the legitimacy of our system, particularly elections. We can't have that happen. Otherwise, we got big problems. And of course, elections are they're state issues too, right? I mean, very much. And if we underfund our electoral system, if we allow people who have a political agenda one way or another to get a hold of that system, we're going to be in trouble.
I mean, you sort of talked about really two things. There's civic engagement, getting people more aware and involved in what's happening at the state level, and then there's this civility question. There's so many elements to that, including social media and how primaries influence how legislators have to respond to sub-constituencies of their constituency. So what do you think we should be doing on civic engagement? Just getting more people to understand and to educate them and about the process. Any ideas, bold ideas for that?
First thing they should do is read my book.
Okay, that's a good idea.
No, but I make light of that, but we got to get them off of their focus on Washington, their total focus on Washington, and get them thinking more about their state capitals. We have lost a lot of news media in state capitals. The good news is there's kind of a resurrection in the nonprofit news that is trying to report on state and local issues. That's a good thing. But we have to get people to try to understand better how their states operate, because a lot of the people who end up being in Congress come out of the state legislatures. And if they don't learn good traits at the state legislative level, it makes it harder for them.
I really recoil at this, sort of, you don't hear it too often, like, oh, the legislatures are the minor leagues, and then you go to Congress. And that's absurd, mainly because, one, I know a fair number of people who have come and have been through Congress, and they're, of course, no more or less talented than the people in legislatures. But two, it's just so you can get so much more done in a state than you can in Washington. I really think the action is in the legislatures.
Yeah, and the state legislatures are interesting because they tend to recognize talent independent of party. I mean, you can develop an expertise so long as it's not too political, and you could be the go-to person in the state legislature anytime a bill like that comes, and people value for that, independent of your seniority. If you're elected to Congress, you could be 435 out of 435, and you won't have the ability to affect anything for at least a decade. And the state legislature, you can jump right in and do things. I remember when I first came, I was assigned to the Courts of Justice Committee, and nobody on Courts of Justice knew anything about adoption law. A whole rewrite of adoption law had been proposed. I knew something about it. I helped write the law. This is a freshman legislator in the Virginia House of Delegates. And there's stories like that all over the country.
And what I think is true about that, too, is that you get that respect across both parties, right? That you can establish that, expertise. And that's one path, I think perhaps the best path, in terms of building reputation as a problem solver and getting something done. What about civility? I mean, is there, you did sort of touch on it. I also, we can't pretend that we don't know, Charlottesville, of course, just 4 years ago, roughly, was the epitome of the breakdown of civility in the nation. One flashpoint of that. What can we do about civility? How can we get back to, and how would you characterize civility when you were in the legislature? Is it better, worse, and how can we make it better?
Well, there's civility and polarization. They're not necessarily the same things. With civility, it's how you treat other people and kind of respect their point of view. That doesn't mean you can't be partisan and argue very vigorously for your point of view. But the key thing is to have some humility and understand that people come from different places and try to put yourself in their shoes so you can understand where they come from. And then eventually you have to take a vote, and you take a vote. But in the process, you can build these relationships with people that allow you, under very stressful conditions, to understand their views a lot better, try to reach some accommodation occasionally.
How did you do that? Was that sort of part of your thinking when you came in, and how did you go about doing that?
Well, one of my goals of being leader was to be able to raise issues that the minority party really felt was important, but do it in a civil way without actually bashing people personally. And I'd like to think that might have been part of my legacy. And I think that people in leadership really have this special responsibility to do that. It's not easy to do in this hyper partisan environment, but we got to rely on the leaders to do it. If you don't have civility, the order can break down, and it's very difficult to do anything without force and coercion, and that just feeds on itself. We can't have that in this country and still survive as an effective democracy.
We just have a couple minutes left. I was thinking about the fact this wonderful element to you that you come from Thomas Jefferson's district, right? We've mentioned him, name checked him a number of times here. Are you much of a student at Jefferson? Have you spent time thinking about him? And
you can't get away from it here, but it's interesting to you could really get back into the philosophy of Jefferson, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In some people's view, the pursuit of happiness was something that people strived for together. It wasn't something like, I'm going to try to make as much money as I can so I can play golf once a week and go on these big vacations. It wasn't like that. The notion that these founding people had, Madison, Jefferson, and the others, was this notion of civic virtue, that you had a responsibility to try to help other people and move the country forward. And that's what was the basis of the civility and the pursuit of happiness. You would find your happiness in helping other people. And lots of folks don't look at those words in that way. Maybe I've reinvented it because Jefferson's been taking so much heat because, he was a slaveholder. He criticized slavery, but he was a slaveholder. There's no doubt about that. But you got to look the power of those words that have animated so many people across the world to think about their lives in different ways. You can't get away from that.
If anyone's listening who has never been to Monticello, you just have to go to get inside the head of this gentleman who, was human and had, was deeply flawed, of course, on slavery. There's no question about that. And had the thought in so many interesting and creative ways about how he lived his life. And of course, had a big stamp on the system that exists to this day. So I would like to close with this one. The name of your book exactly, so if people are putting it into Amazon, they know exactly what to type in.
Fighting Political Gridlock. Put that in, you'll find it.
Fighting Political Gridlock. And David Toscano, Toscano, and
Toscano. You hold your fingers together like the Italians do.
Published by University of Virginia Press, I guess, is right. And so aside from that book, what else are you reading, or what would you commend to legislators or legislative staff who just need to know more about this topic or anything? What would make them a better part of the legislative institution? What would you suggest, or even a TV show or a movie? What do you tell people to look into?
I'm reading 100 Years of Solitude right now, so you can only spend so much time doing politics, right? But if you want to go to a place where you really can learn a lot about states, go to the website of the National Conference of State Legislatures. I mean, I'm not kidding. There is so much there, and look at and way back of all the things that you all have written about. It's just so much to be learned, and again, it's whatever you want to make of it. There are things about healthcare, there are things about state constitutions, but just keep reading. Biggest joy in my life is I learned something new every day. If I can keep doing that, I'll be in good shape. That's
a secret right there. You can keep living if you keep learning. That's for sure. It's part of it. And thank you for the gracious promotion of the website. I would agree. We have an extremely robust website with everything and anything about state policy that goes way back, not back to 1619 House of Burgesses in Virginia. Do you know why they adjourned? It's one of my favorite trivia questions. They adjourned after just 5 days. Do you know why they adjourned on such a short?
You got me there, Tim. You got to tell me.
There was a malaria outbreak, and one of the delegates one of the Burgesses died, actually, on the third day of the session. So we've come a long way, at least. You can see by the response by legislatures to COVID going to remote sessions. Had they had Zoom, back then, maybe they would have done that, but they decided it's better to go home in the public safety. Well, we won't fault you for not knowing that trivia about Virginia, which has such a deep history, but delightful conversation, and really, really appreciate your time, and I hope people will take advantage of the thoughts you put into the book and how much time you put into that.
And that concludes this episode of our podcast. We encourage you to review and rate our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, or Spotify. We also encourage you to check out our other podcasts, Our American States, and the special series, Building Democracy. For the National Conference of State Legislatures, thanks for listening.